I'm going to start with a story. It's called Be Yourself by Cortland Dahl. And Cortland Dahl works for the Center for Healthy Minds in University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it's part of a meditation. I actually have the app and use it all the time for a couple of years now. And it's part of a meditation where he's talking about the expression where people say to you, just be yourself. And he kind of plays with that idea. And so I'm jumping into the middle of the meditations, just so you know the background. I was talking about this with my friend Jay, and he shared a great example. When he was a kid, his parents enrolled him in piano lessons, and it didn't take long for him to realize that he was not a very musical person. He hated the lessons, and he gave up pretty quick. But a decade after those miserable piano lessons, Jay got really into a band called the White Stripes, and he bought a cheap guitar on a whim. It wasn't long before he discovered he did have some natural talent. He picked it up without any lessons, and it quickly became a huge part of his life. This supposedly unmusical kid now has been performing concerts, recording albums, and writing songs for almost 2 decades. So what happened? Was Jay a musical person or not? Maybe Jay's true self was musical and he just didn't know it. Or did he change from an unmusical person to a musical one? And if he changed, then which one is the real Jay? The very idea of a musical person is only a concept. And our concepts, as Jay experienced, can be very limiting. I wonder how many times Jay declined to go to a music concert or to go to a music class because he wasn't musical. That's what he convinced himself. He thought he knew his true self, and that his true self sucked at music, right? With insight, he might have seen that his earlier experiences with the piano didn't define him. It was just one of the many fleeting experiences that happened to make a strong impression on his young mind. So Cort goes on, if you reflect on your own life, what beliefs and concepts hold sway over you? What ideas about yourself do you carry from year to year like a suitcase packed full of old clothes? And now think about how much has changed. How much have you learned and grown? What new experiences have you had? It could be your identity, it could be your career, your social roles. How have you evolved over the years? Now, your eye color is probably the same as it was years ago, but look how different you are physically. Your body is entirely made up of new cells now than it was a couple years ago, and your mind has completely new thoughts. And yet none of this fully captures who you are. So if everything is constantly changing, what is the stable identity that continues through your life? To put it simply, who are you? Well, I have one answer for that question, of course. I'm your minister. So I would say you're Unitarian Universalist if you're sitting here or watching and listening to me today. And so just a reminder, transformation is one of our values that we're focused on this month. And this is a graphic representation of our Unitarian Universalist values, kind of created like a flower, with each petal being one of them, with love in the center, meaning that we are encouraged to live love-centered lives. And this month, transformation, which is the one right next to the, there we go, the words that I put out there. If you read each of the values, in the middle, there's a statement, because we are a congregation, we are a collection of people that come together that are like-minded. And so as a collaborative fellowship, we promise to be with one another and support one another. So there's always a statement with every value. And this one says, we covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. So covenant's just a fancy word for promise. To collectively, Yes, many of us were strong individuals. We go off and do things ourselves, and that's okay. You come here on Sunday morning or midweek to be supported in your individual journey, and then maybe find some other people that are on a similar journey and collectively do it together. But the point is to ultimately transform and grow spiritually and ethically. Well, when I saw that, I thought, okay, that's a big ask. How do we do that? And immediately, for some reason, oh, I know why, it's spring. I grew up in a church that was Christian, and every Easter there'd be this big old purple banner with this monarch butterfly on it. So that's why I titled this sermon, It's Butterfly Time Again, because we're cycling around to that springtime when everything changes. So that's the metaphor that I used. And then I also picked that reading because of its personal transformation, the reading from the rabbi. And I would change his word from repair to transform. If you see what needs to be transformed and how to transform it, then you found a piece of the world that God has left for you to complete. But if you only see what is wrong and ugly in the world, then it is you yourself that needs to be transformed. So I think it's a challenge to us from a deeply spiritual leader to give us a reason to change. And I got to tell you, I think you all shared this experience, but if you listen to the news, I tend to be in my car a lot, so I tend to listen to news rather than see it. Social media, I find myself slipping into the rabbi's second statement. I mean, between all of the polarization that continues in our society, the gun violence, and now a couple of wars, and all the brutality that we constantly are bombarded with, it's not hard to slip into a negative mind frame. So I said, I guess it's my task as your minister to give you suggestions, a way to think about repairing, transforming, and growing ourselves. So I went to a model that came out of my seminary, and we called it the reflective learning model. And I actually went out and researched to see if this was some famous person's model. It sounds like this is just a common model that's out there and is used over and over again in different settings. And this is the one that our provost, Sharon Welsh, created when we recreated our seminary. So let me talk about that a little bit. I was in the guinea pig class in 2009. Traditional seminaries, and I think many are still this way, you go, it's a residential program, you go for 3 years, and it's all classroom and all learning and all this stuff you have to absorb over 3 years. And then the 4th year, you do a internship at some congregation for the entire year. So the concept is you have to get all this learning under your belt, in your head, in your memory, to be ready to go out and do it. I think there's a lot of professions that are similar. Well, Meadville Lombard in Chicago decided to reinvent itself, and they realized that maybe wasn't a practical model in this day and age. So they got rid of the residential program, and they condensed it from 4 years down to 3 years, and you did both simultaneously. And so the idea was that, so people, I'm seeing the gazes on their look, how does that work? So I could live here, I didn't need to move to Chicago. And we would go to Chicago 2 to 5 times a year for an entire week. And you read all the readings beforehand, maybe did a paper, showed up, had a month's, semester's worth of class in 1 week, and then you had a follow-up project. And so you went through theology, you went through social justice, you went through power dynamics, congregational organization, everything, over 3 years in this model. And then when you came back home, you were expected to apply it. And so that's where this reflective learning model came in. You had been just learning something. The first year you had congregational studies, or excuse me, community studies. The next 2 years you had congregational studies. My community studies was 10 hours a week at the women's shelter in Appleton, which is about 4 blocks from my house, so it was easy to get there. And then the internship was a half-time internship, about 20 hours a week, the following 2 years, and I did mine at First Universalist Unitarian in Wausau. So let me kind of talk about how this model would work. So you're in Chicago, you're doing some studying, understanding what you're talking about, and then you come out of that and you have to make an intentional plan of how you're going to apply it. So in this case, we all had our sites, and you would go and work there and think about things, and I'll give you some examples in a minute. And that's really the action. So you're planning ahead of time, you're intentionally know what you're going to do and what you're setting out to do. You go to the site or take the action, even if you're at home. And then you come back, and this is the step I think a lot of people don't do, is reflect and share. And in our program, it was built in. We had a dialogue triad, we called it. So there were me and two other of my peers, and we were anywhere in North America. And we would get together every week for at least an hour, and it was virtual, long before the pandemic. And we would talk about how things were working with us. And then once a month, the entire class would be together with our advisors, and they'd have formal questions that we were working our way through. So that's how we did the reflect and share. Then there was always more classes and more readings, and then going back to where you were. And it just went around and around and around. And I found it very helpful because, as Sharon Welch, the designer of all this, said, our lives aren't that neat. You don't have the learning part of your life and then the experience part of life. It all mashes up together, especially if you're a minister, and you better just get used to it right away. So that's what we did. So let me just talk a little bit about those. When I say study, in my case, it was a very formal environment with a classroom, but it can be whatever it is that works best for you. It can be reading, it could be a lecture series that's going on in somewhere in town, it could be museums, small groups, one-on-one if you have a mentor or a loved one that's really into learning about the same thing, or just the media. I mean, YouTube, you can find a video on almost anything and any topic that's out there. Planning or action. Find and then engage with something that causes you to immerse yourself. Push a little harder on the borders of your comfort zone. Make it multisensory, make it experiential. Do more than just watch a video, I guess is what I'm saying. Then reflect. You could reflect by journaling, just centering yourself. But it's got a point. If we're supposed to grow spiritually and ethically, then the whole point is sitting there and thinking about how did that grow you spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally. So I have to stop for a second, because physically, like, well, what would it happen physically? In my case, the reason I was at this women's shelter, so think about this. Why would a man be going into a women's shelter? Okay, that's set up for a problem right from the beginning. But the director wanted to experiment because they had they have children, but they had some teenagers, particularly boys, that she realized had never ever seen a positive male role model in their life. And so they wanted me to just come there and hang out with the kids and do stuff. And I split it apart 5 hours a couple times a week. And there was one boy who he had been through hell, frankly, and he was 11 or 12 at the time, I don't remember, and he just loved it when I came. He knew when I was going to be there. He'd be waiting by the door. In fact, sometimes we'd have 12 kids there. He was the oldest, and they would come, and I'd walk in the door, and they'd just glom onto me. So I'm walking like Frankenstein because they're on my legs and this kind of thing. I remember one time we watched the movie Up together, the Disney Pixar movie. And I was sitting on the couch, and I had one kid on each leg, and then I had another kid sitting each next to me, and then one was on the floor on my feet, and then one was laying across the top of the couch. They had to touch me somehow. It was just kind of a remarkable experience. So physically was a part of it. And one thing was this younger boy, 12-year-old boy, he liked to roughhouse. And, like a lot of kids do with their dads. I guess it's a typical thing. So we were out in the yard roughhousing, chasing each other around. And at one point, I realized that he didn't have a lot of boundaries. And I realized I was being choked. I couldn't breathe. And so I fortunately was stronger than he was, and I could pull him off. And we had to talk about that if you grew up in a world where all you see is violence and there's no boundary on anything, how would he know where that is and what that meant? So it was one of my reflections, because at first you're like, oh my gosh, I have to get out of here. This is not acceptable, and you want to yell at him. And of course, I think I probably did at first because I was startled. But then you have to put it in context. So it was a very meaningful thing to be reflecting on. And so then you have to go, well, how did that make me grow spiritually or ethically? And one of the ethical parts was learning about my privilege in a deeper way than I ever had before. I mean, look at me. I'm a big, white, middle-aged male, and I'm in this place with women who have been battered by people that probably look a lot like me. And one time I was called over there in the middle of the night because somebody had been taken in and they wanted somebody to help the kid. And so I just stayed with the kid. So I'm walking around this building and they'd lowered the lights, so not very many lights are on. Can you imagine if you were a woman living there and this big guy comes around the corner real fast in the dark or semi-dark? So it was all a concept of how do I think of myself as being smaller, not moving fast, respecting the people that are there and not just taking it for granted that I live in this male world kind of thing. So it was very moving for me to think about that ethically and what that means. So then sharing, you heard how I was sharing. If you go on a journey like this, share with others at the fellowship, share your ideas and feelings with loved ones. If you have a mentor or someone that you really trust, or you could even set up something to come and talk to your minister if you'd like to share what's going on with you. Just for those of you that are visitors and not that acquainted with the fellowship perhaps, or newcomers, we have chalice circles here. They're theme-based sharing, where you go deep on a topic. Like this whole month we've been talking about transformation. But there's affinity groups, and these are usually, you have a common perspective or interest. Often the most obvious, they're broken up by gender, those that identify as female or male, but they can be however that wants to be set up. They can be age, you can be young adults, retirees. Often in UU congregations, it's by spiritual path. People have chosen they really like Buddhism or Christianity or humanism or Judaism, or often in this part of the world, nature-based traditions. But the one I want to talk a little bit more about today is social justice, social causes, because it seems to unite a lot of Unitarian Universalists and it becomes a spiritual journey. So environmentalism is the obvious one. There's a lot of talk about poverty, equal rights, or systemic injustice. And here I have to branch off to a quote. Maybe some of you have been on a Zoom meeting with Lois Lawler. She's over at the Point Fellowship. She's an 86-year-old former nun who's probably one of our best Zoom hosts. She's all over it. She was terrified of COVID and quarantined herself for over 2 years, but she talks to everybody she knows daily on Zoom. It's just a remarkable thing. And last week I was on another Zoom call with her, and she said that in the 40 years that she was a nun, she was often assigned to very underprivileged populations in Texas and Colorado and even in Missouri. And her whole sole role was education and trying to come up with ways that they could try to escape the world that they lived in that was so hard. And over those 4 decades, she kind of ultimately realized that she could work herself to death and it would hardly scratch the surface of the problem, and that the system had to change to make a real difference. Now, she decided to leave the order not just because of this, but once she left the order, she poured her talents into getting people elected and programs in place to help with systemic justice. She actually became the chair of the Democratic Party for Portage County, got them a building, got them really fired up. And sometimes I say, I'm not sure this is entirely true, but every election, there's this one county over there in that part of the state that's blue or surrounded by red, and I swear that's Lois and her work over in that county. So it's nice that she denies that, but I think it just says a lot about who she is, how she reflected on her life, and then really did something to make a difference, and she still hasn't worn out yet. So that's the reflective learning model. So I'm going to end what I wanted to say today is by giving you some examples that you can take on your own or in a group to get involved to think about this kind of thing. The one thing is the Unitarian Universalist Association we're not a strict hierarchical kind of place. So they've always thought of themselves as, oh, well, if you're doing that, come on in. If you're doing that, come on in. And so there was all these social justice initiatives going on, and each one of them would fundraise with the same people, and sometimes they'd be conflicted and all that. In the last 5 years, they've done a great job of organizing it in a way that makes sense. And it's all under the umbrella of Side with Love. I have my t-shirt for you to see today. And under Side with Love, it's very well organized and has made a big impact. So there's an introductory video I want to share with you. And the woman who starts it is the director of it. And she was actually a colleague of mine in seminary, Ashley Haran. And while she was a student, was also the part-time minister at Open Circle Fellowship back in the day. So there's this weird connection of everything here. So I just want to play the video. It's 3 minutes long. And bear with me, it's not a smooth thing to flip through Zoom this way.
As Unitarian Universalists, our faith demands that we put our values into practice. We know that both our people and our planet are sacred. We know the beloved community is not complete without the sacred presence of everyone. Every gender, every sexuality, every voice, everybody is invited to side with love.
Side with Love is the hub for all of our outfacing justice work of our association. No matter who you are or where you are, there is a place for you to side with love. You can put your faith into action through one of our signature campaigns, You the Vote, Create Climate Justice, Uplift, and Love Resists.
We invite Unitarian Universalists to develop their leadership and organizing skills, deepen their political and spiritual grounding, and take meaningful action in solidarity with our partners to build a world in which all of our communities are free and thriving. Though the questions may change, how to achieve climate justice, who to elect, our response remains the same: side with love. When our electoral process was under attack in 2020 and 2021, UUs made more than 3 million contacts to turn people out to the polls, talk about our values, and defend our democracy.
When our partners asked us to show up in solidarity to stop Line 3, hundreds of UUs participated in direct action and public witness from the Northwoods of Minnesota to the streets of Washington, D.C. When Texas, Alabama, and Florida passed legislation attacking LGBTQ people, UU showed up in force online and in their own communities to speak up to protect our siblings and to fight for trans and queer lives.
When the president broke his promises about expanding immigrant detention, UUs showed up for distributed actions across the country, demanding the immediate closure of all detention centers.
To side with love means to put our values into action. And no matter who you are, or what your skills or your passions, there is a role for you. Whether it is joining one of our volunteer squads, participating in our organizing school, coming to one of our skill ups, joining one of our monthly community of praxis meetings, or taking action through our Action Center and joining us to learn together about the issues through our political education webinars. Everyone has a place in our shared work for justice. There are many ways for you and your congregation to side with love. We need all of us, including you, to be a part of our shared work for justice and liberation. Get started right now by texting LOVE to 866-533-1494.
So in case you couldn't memorize it that fast, I thought I'd put up a slide that has the text number 866-533-1494. When I delivered it to this open circle, somebody did do it right while I was talking. So anyway, it's sidewithlove.org if you want to go back to this site. And then there's another one that's more local. It's wusan.org. Wusan stands for Wisconsin Unitarian Universalist State Action Network. I'm actually the vice president, and it's an organization that's been working at getting organized for about a decade. Janice is part of it as well. And it's really got up and running. It unfortunately started kind of during COVID, got up and running. So it's been a slow start. But equally, they've gotten a lot more organized lately at helping you know where there are resources and specifically activities you can do that are right in Wisconsin. So I'm going to take you to that website and I'll show you what I'm doing. Okay, so once again, it's Wisconsin Unitarian Universalist Social Action Network. See if I can get rid of the boxes. So if you go to actions and the take action part on the screen, you'll see that they list all the things. We just had a UU the vote, which is the whole name of the initiative to get people to the polls, so that democracy only works if everybody votes. They just had a kickoff last week. There was a pilgrimage on March 16th in Wausau, so not of it, all of it is down in Milwaukee and Madison. There were all kinds of advocacy choices down in Madison. There's one I wanted to show here somewhere. Yeah, wisdom. So where's Lori? Yeah, so all right, Joshua is the organization in Green Bay that we partner with as a church, and Lori is our representative there. Wisdom is the umbrella organization. Each city has a different name, and so it's on here and what they're doing, just things like that, and it's all over the state. So you can also sign up to get a weekly newsletter that just pops all of these right into your email, so you don't even have to go out to the website. So just something that we're doing to help you to help you navigate the world and get out there and do something in this. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. So I'm going to go back. It's butterfly time and this butterfly life cycle. Because if you really think about it, you know, the eggs are out there on the milkweed right now, and pretty soon they're going to just become these funny looking worm thingies that are caterpillars eaten and turn into this chrysalis, which it's a remarkable thing when you think about it, that these little caterpillars melt down to muck, just genetic muck. And then I was told there's these things called islands, I guess, maybe that's a nickname, in there that attract the different cells, and then ultimately that's the blueprint for this butterfly that emerges later. So if you think about it, it's kind of even a closer metaphor to our lives. This caterpillar is just sort of slowly crawling along, munching, avoiding birds that might want to eat them, pretty content with the status quo. And then change happens in their lives. Maybe the caterpillar tried eating something new or ended up in a new environment where things were changing. And you get into this cocooning stage, just like us. You decide to make some change as well. And that decision requires a lot of reflection. But eventually, hopefully, we all come out as some beautiful butterfly or moth, this beautiful winged creature that is so amazing because it's so beautiful and yet so light. It can just fly wherever it wants. It's an amazing symbol of a new way of being in the world. So I'm going to leave you with, isn't it time to lean into our own transformation cycle? Transform ourselves by growing spiritually and ethically. My friends, let's go. Let's transform, just like nature's trying to do right now with this mucky gray, whatever snow thing that's going on out there, into this luscious green landscape. I was just in Chicago yesterday and it's all green and the flowers are blooming. So that is coming our way, I promise. And that's when the butterflies will start happening, and hopefully we can do it too. Thank you. Now let's have a moment of silence